Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. Russia is delivering to the Syrian military 3 battalion sets of the advanced S-300 PM surface-to-air missile systems. The move comes as a response to the Syrian accidental shooting of a Russian Il-20 spy plane on the 17th of September, for which the Russian Defense Ministry has blamed Israel. To discuss the challenges the deployment of these systems pose to the Jewish state, I'm joined here in the studio by Lieutenant Colonel in Reserve Reuven Ben Shalom, who is a cross-cultural strategist and a columnist at the Jerusalem Post. Welcome. I'd like also to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Gideon Remez, who is a research fellow at the Truman Institute at Hebrew University, Jerusalem. Welcome. Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding of the latest developments with regard to this topic.
Our two guests here have better connections to the Israeli Air Force, Reuven having been a helicopter pilot, and Gideon being the son of the founding commander of the Israeli Air Force, General Amir Remez, during whose time Israeli fighter planes shot down 5 British Spitfires over the Sinai. So this was, in a way, the precedent for a later shootdown of 5 Soviet planes by Israeli fighters, which Gideon covers in his book, The Soviet-Israeli War from 1967 to 1973. So leaving aside for a moment the military aspects, one has to ask what is going on in the strategic relationship between Israel and Russia. After so many meetings between Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Putin, most of which occurred in Moscow. President Putin did visit Israel, but usually it is Netanyahu who makes the pilgrimage to Moscow. Is the relationship fraying, or is it only the anger expressed by the Defense Ministry and personally by Defense Minister Shoigu, and Putin is more moderate? So one has to see whether this process, which you cited, of the transfer of the surface-to-air system, first of all into the territory of Syria, and later on to the hands of the Syrian forces, whether this is going to impact not only on the military balance between Syria and Israel, but also on the strategic relationship between Moscow and Jerusalem.
Colonel Ben Shalom?
I also, even though I have an Air Force background, I also think the military aspect here is less important. The people that are tasked with doing whatever needs to be done on the ground or in the air will do it, of course, whatever systems they are challenged with. The strategic aspect here is very interesting. Now, I'm not preaching you now as an expert. I'm just telling you what happens to me personally as an Israeli. I keep thinking that I understand the situation, and then something happens, and then I understand that I didn't understand. I thought I had the North pretty figured out. Even though Israel does not have a policy in many other arenas, here we had a very clear policy. Israel was acting to thwart Iranian entrenchment in the region. Very good relations with Russia. So Russia was, I wouldn't say on our side, but enabling our actions there. And I pretty much had it figured out. I thought the Russians did not see eye to eye with the Iranians, but converged specifically for things that had to be done now. This thing changed it for me. I also do no longer think the S-300 is here because of the downing of the plane. I think it's part of a broader picture that was maybe used as part of this timing because of what happened now. So the Russians maybe use the specific timing, but I more and more see them aligned with Iran as to what needs to happen on the ground. They are all promoting their long-term interests in the region. So I don't think Iran is going anywhere. I don't think Russia is going anywhere. And we can talk later on about the ramifications for our action in the region. I'm just telling you, I have an interesting time figuring out the strategic picture.
Nevertheless, when we're talking about the military dimension, obviously the S-300 PM has a range of about 200 kilometers when it comes to missile engagement. To what degree does that pose a challenge to Israel if, for instance, they would now deploy such a battery next to Damascus, which is only 143 kilometers away from Haifa, which is a central city within Israel? How does Israel actually look at this situation, not only in the strategic level, but also on the tactical level?
On the tactical level, I think that those that are tasked with the mission of carrying out strikes throughout the region and in Syria, they have a whole array of challenges and threats, and this is one of them. I agree that is pretty much top on the list. Remember that it was manufactured in 79. I remember working on preparing for this system 20 years ago. So it's true that the variant that arrived now is relatively advanced. On the other hand, I think there are less components that maybe we thought they would bring. So altogether, is this a token footprint of the S-300 or a serious change of the strategic balance? I would say, to answer this operationally, certainly a challenge, but a challenge that we will know how to address. There's no question they will position it in a strategic location like Damascus with a range of 200 kilometers. It reaches way into Israel and over the Mediterranean. If they have several of these components, it covers the entire region. But a new system coming online, it's not automatic. You don't just draw a circle and then you can't penetrate it. There are many other aspects, from electronic warfare to stealth capabilities to, by the way, as a helicopter pilot, I'll tell you, just flying low where he can't see you. So there are many other things that can be done. Hopefully, I think that also the point where we're actually flying against this system, or that this system is trying to down us, is also not tomorrow morning. Remember that currently there are Russian operators. This is a Russian system with Russian operators, that they're going to start to teach the Syrians about its capabilities. There already has been an S-300 system and S-400 system inside of Syria, but we work very closely. We have a good coordination or deconfliction system with the Syrians. So again, the question is not tomorrow.
You mean the
morning.
Russians?
I'm
The
sorry.
Russians,
Yes,
yes.
the Russians. Sorry.
Mr. Remez, we hear, of course, also from Colonel Ben Shalom and from other people within the defense community, the whole challenge now with Moscow pertaining to its keen interest of bolstering its relations with the Islamic Republic of Iran, as opposed to previous assessments that they're not so keen of having the Iranians within Syria. To what degree is this actually challenging Israel? And there are also reports now about Moscow trying to establish behind the scenes some kind of communications line between Jerusalem and Tehran?
Well, I never shared those assessments that the Russians somehow were either going to control the Iranians in Syria on our behalf, on Israel's behalf, or maybe even get them out of there at our request. Since the Russian involvement in Syria, the military involvement in Syria began about 3 years ago, my co-researcher Isabella Guinor and I have been warning that there's, in the long distance, a collision course here. Because the Russian interest, while Russia has no interest in provoking a conflict with Israel, they're not going to do it on purpose. But if they have to make a choice between their much more basic and wide-ranging commitment to the Iran-Assad-Hezbollah axis and whatever agreement or accommodation they have with Israel, then it was quite clear to us what side they would favor. Mm-hmm. And this tipping point was bound to come at some time in the future then, 3 years ago. And it appears to be fast approaching, if it hasn't arrived at this point with the downing of that Russian aircraft, which, by the way, was either unknown or at least unpublicized until it was shot down, because that aircraft is part of an integrated air defense system. Mm-hmm. Okay, it's not as if as you mentioned, the S-300 and S-400 have been there for 3 years already, but controlled and operated by the Russians in and around their bases, the naval base at Tartus and the air base at Khmeimim near Latakia. Okay, as if that was a separate entity from the Syrians. The question is not who's registered as the owner of those batteries. The question is what their rules of engagement are, what the purpose of their use is. And if so far the Russians have been saying, okay, we'll allow the Israelis to operate in Syrian skies under certain conditions, but now they've crossed a red line, and we have to put a stop to this. The question is how far they'll go. Now, the downing of that Ilyushin happened almost a month ago. Since then, there have been no further reports of Israeli strikes in Syria. That's a longer interval than we've seen so far for quite a while. Mm-hmm. And there's no indication that the Iranians have changed their activity in Syria. So something here has changed. Either Israel is just giving itself a break and let's let the Russians cool off for a while, and then we can start again. And as the colonel here already mentioned, okay, we have had 3 years already to study the specifications of the Russian anti-aircraft systems because they've been there and operating. So we'll find a way to overcome them, and we'll do that further down the line, risking an all-out confrontation with the Russians. Or Israel has accepted that there's been a sea change in the situation now, and we no longer have a green light from the Russians to operate in Syrian skies against Iranians or anyone else. And this remains to be seen. I said the day that the plane was down and the Russians began their really aggressive, sometimes hostile statements against Israel, which could have been just a cover-up for their own mess-up in this incident, that there's going to be a hiatus now in the Israeli activity. Let's see how long it lasts.
This is something that remains to be seen indeed. Mr. Oren, when we're talking about the Russian Air Force in Syria, it's not the first time that a Russian plane has been shot down by some kind of ally or partner in a strategic level. We had, of course, also the Turkish incident where a Turkish F-16 fighter jet shot down a Russian plane, something that strained relations between the two countries. But after having various discussions between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Russian President Vladimir Putin, we saw a shift in that relationships to a more positive course. Now Israel, of course,
but
is facing
only after
same.
the Russian ambassador to Ankara was assassinated.
That is correct. Another unfortunate incident for both countries and their relationship. To what degree do you think that this situation will now also bring Israel and Russia to somewhat of a cooling down, and then might emerge yet again a certain understanding between the two countries?
An honest answer would have to be that the Russian mind is inscrutable to Israelis. Now, it's ironic because if you go back to the 1950s, when Prime Minister Ben-Gurion met President Eisenhower in 1960, one of the first things that Ben-Gurion told Eisenhower was that we, the Israeli leadership, know the Russians. We came from Russia. They were born in the 19th century. We know their mind. You Americans don't. The West has no body of knowledge. We can tell you. Now, perhaps it was true, but it is no longer so. And Israel has made constantly a series of failures of either intelligence or decision-making regarding the Soviet or later Russian moves. So who knows how Putin is going to behave.
Even with Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman being a Russian native speaker and having various relations with Russia himself?
Yes, he was born in Moldova, but which was under Russian rule as a part of the Soviet Union. But yes, apparently there are not that many Russian-born or Russian culturally oriented people in key places in the intelligence assessment community. When it comes up eventually to the decision-making cabinet, it's too late. However, one aspect that we haven't touched on yet, and which, of course, has a lot of bearing on this issue, is that the American-Russian relationship has soured. Whatever hopes Putin had for Trump's election evaporated because both the Democrats and the Pentagon and the intelligence community have resisted Trump's efforts to soften the line towards Moscow. And Israel is considered a military ally of the United States, and therefore Russia, however warm the relationship on the political level, Russia will never see Israel as a partner.
So speaking specifically about the American situation now, when we're talking about the downing of the Russian plane and the delivery of the S-300 to the Syrian regime, to what degree is the United States aligned with Jerusalem? We hear, of course, the commander of Central Command, the general there, talking very harshly about the situation. We hear also the U.S. ambassador to NATO speaking very harshly about this, even suggesting a possible American military interference in order to make sure that it doesn't come online. Is this something that might escalate between Russia and the United States in Syria, with implications also to Israel obviously being dragged into it?
On the rhetorical level, yes, because the administration and specifically Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called it a serious escalation. But if you look at it from a practical point of view, the Trump administration wants to declare victory over the Islamic State, stabilize Syria to some extent in order to avert humanitarian disasters in Idlib and other places, and go home. And the Americans have no stamina, no staying power in Syria. The Russians do. The Russians have decided to make the Latakia naval base and Khamimim air base permanent. This is their foothold in the Eastern Mediterranean. They are going to outstay the Americans. So there is hardly any comparison.
Colonel Ben Shalom?
I'm sorry, my main field of expertise in my military background was the American portfolio, but still here in this, they're irrelevant. I'm sorry to say. Of course, important strategically, our number one ally. There's no way, of course, to compare our intimate relations with the Americans to our coordination or deconfliction with the Russians. But the Russians are on the ground, and they rule the skies and the ground of Syria, and this is, they call the shots. As far as the Americans, of course, are more important in the UN playground and other aspects. We also have to be very careful as Israel, and I keep emphasizing here our size and our scope. We are only Israel. We are not a superpower, even though we are a regional power to be considered. So I wouldn't recommend that we go in between the United States and Russia, because they have serious tensions that go way beyond Syria.
Nevertheless, we hear Mr. Remez talking about a possible all-wide escalation in case that this might indeed deteriorate to a conflict between trying to maintain Israel's red lines and Russian interests in Syria.
It's all about interests. I don't see any interest of any party here to escalate or go to something all out. Absolutely no reason. I also don't call what happened now an escalation. I believe this is a strategic shift. In a way, for us, it's more of an awakening of strategic patterns that maybe we missed. Okay, now I don't like it that when something happens, it happens all over, especially in the US these days, where something happens and then depends about your political side, you will interpret things. So I don't like it now that everyone's saying, oh, so this intimate relation between Netanyahu and Putin was all fake, it all meant nothing. No, it's important. It is important, and it will be important in the future. But yes, we have constructed something in our mind, I think, that was too shallow, two-dimensional, binary, and as usual, that is not the case.
Mr. Remez, continuing on the matter of the Putin-Netanyahu relationship, Prime Minister Netanyahu earlier this week announced that he plans on meeting with President Putin in the near future. He didn't specify, as you noted, the specific date for this meeting. Nevertheless, he did discuss, since the development on the Syrian front with Putin twice in two separate phone conversations, the implications and the importance, of course, of the military coordination between the IDF and the Russian military. To what degree is this relationship actually in place? Should we go in line with what Colonel Ben Shalom stated, that we shouldn't interpret it as a bogus relationship, but rather as a relationship that has some implications to it?
It's not bogus. But we have to remember that, well, Putin may be inscrutable, as Amir said, but to some degree we know his background, at least. He's a KGB operative. He's well trained. He married upon orders. He does not let personal considerations or personal sentiments that dictate his policy. So it doesn't hurt for him to be on good speaking relationships with Netanyahu. But if anyone, including Netanyahu, think that that is going to change Putin's strategy beyond very small adjustments, such as that outlier of a statement that Putin made the day after the aircraft downing, then that's illusory. That's not the way the Soviets used to work, and it's not the way the Russians or Putin work today. And it's not only the defense establishment. The Russian embassy in Tel Aviv, which of all people should be the ones most interested in maintaining a working relationship, put out one of the most pugnacious statements afterwards, and they didn't do it on their own say-so. In respect to the Americans, I'd like to add that the military establishment and the State Department and all of Trump's underlings may want to maintain some kind of confrontational attitude towards the Russians. But if Putin still has President Trump by the short and curly, and it certainly looked like that at the Helsinki summit and afterwards, then he is the commander-in-chief, sadly. And it's hardly to be trusted that he will be the one to tell Putin up to here and no more. At the most, he can have sanctions imposed on him by Congress, but he's not going to take any initiative, certainly. And it's even hard to see him going along with any really forceful steps towards to the Russians.
Well, the predictability of Trump is still in question when it comes to the
I'll make
course
one
of action.
prediction that I'm still sticking by the prediction that I made on his inauguration day, that he won't last out his first term.
Well, we'll see about that. Mr. Oren?
A couple of points. One is that a characteristic feature of Israeli thinking is what was called once in the Israeli military community, forcing your logic upon the enemy. Israel would have done or is doing things in a certain way, and therefore, when looking at the other side, it could be the adversary or a third party, it stands to reason that they are supposed to act in a similar fashion. When Israel attacks, and there is a spy plane dozens of miles away from there, it stands to reason that it will land somewhere away from the action, or wait hovering above until it is all over. And Israeli air defense systems would not fire wildly into the air, hitting everybody in sight or out of sight, which is why Israel never imagined that the Russians would not land their plane and that the Syrians would fire in such a fashion that they would down the plane. Another point. During the Yom Kippur War, and as part of what Gideon and Isabella called the Soviet-Israeli War, the Soviet trained and directed air defense system in Egypt managed to hit the Israeli Air Force quite badly, including the anti-aircraft guns, not only the missiles.
Some may say that it even crippled the Israeli Air Force in certain areas.
Well, this usually happened during the War of Attrition 3 years earlier, but in any event, the Israeli Air Force had to take note of it. And following the war, the commanding general of the Air Force, Benny Peled, decreed that the Air Force must have its own commando unit, which is called Chaldag. It's like the SAS in Britain. It's their own special air squadron. And therefore, it doesn't mean that Israel must shoot at the surface-to-air battery from a fighter plane. It has other means, first of all, to get at the Iranian deliveries. The entire purpose of this strike was to stop the Iranian deliveries from reaching Lebanon via Syria. So the Israeli ingenuity will find other ways of Mossad crippling those deliveries before they get there, or putting something on another device so that it will explode later on, or a commando unit will get there. Israel will find a way. We don't have to project into the future what happened over the last couple of years.
If I can continue this line of thinking, even what you're saying is still the typical Israeli thinking commando style and boots on the ground. But let's take this to the technological aspect. This is just hinting to us where the world is going. And that is no more brave pilots have to penetrate airspace. All you need to do is press a button and send the robots. They have artificial intelligence. They know to hit the targets on the spot. And this is where we're going. So we're talking about shifts today. It's not only strategic shifts, but the entire way we operate.
But what happens when your decision makers are robots? That's the problem. Not necessarily in Israel.
Interesting.
There are
And what
movies
happens?
about that.
And what happens when General Murphy intervenes? Something can always go wrong. You can have, imagine if Israel was to attack not only Syria, but even Iran, as has been projected several times in the past. And one Israeli aircraft should either be shot down or have a technical failure, and the pilot will have to eject. Imagine the Israeli scene for the months and years after that.
Israeli Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman alluded on several occasions, specifically about shifting the focus from trying to thwart the Iranians from transferring those shipments to Lebanon via Syria, but rather already target them both in Iraq or in Iran, something that garnered a lot of heat from Baghdad and other places in the region. To what degree is that now a reality?
Well, if those reports, I have no idea whether they're reliable, but if those reports that Putin is trying to find some kind of back channel way to deconflict Israel and Iran, he may be on the right track.
Well,
don't forget that once Iran was Israel's ally in the so-called periphery strategy of the 1950s. We wanted non-Arab countries in the periphery on our side. The fact that Israel supported the Shah and thus became the little devil for the Islamic revolutionaries is another matter. But there's no basic conflict of interest between Israel and Iran.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you a closing statement and an assessment for the near future. Colonel Ben Shalom, we'll start with you.
I think the very near future, what we're going to see is silence from the Israeli, at least military administration. I think there's understanding now that we should talk less. Maybe not even do more right now, as we see that's happening, but there's understanding that we've been talking maybe too much. We're very emboldened because our incredible capabilities, wonderful intelligence. We've been talking a lot about these strikes. I think what we're going to see is the policy will continue because what needs to be done will be done, probably under the radar screen with less dramatic announcements.
Mr. Perez?
Remez, and
Remez,
I think there's going to be now a lull for at least a few months. And where it goes after that will depend, as you mentioned before, not only on Israel. We're not the only players in this drama. But as far as it depends on Israel, certainly there will be attempts to confront the Iranian menace, if it's still there, by other means. Armaments can be delivered by sea, they can be delivered by train, they can be delivered in a number of different ways. So that I doubt that we are going to see another direct confrontation between Israel and Russia because the Israelis will do their best to avoid it.
Mr. Oren?
The Russian Defense Ministry has called Israel ungrateful, saying that Israel made several requests, which the Russians honored, and this is the thanks that we get. So from now on, it's a new relationship. We have to see whether Israel has really used up its account regarding its requests.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Colonel Reuven Ben Shalom for being here today. I'd like to thank also Mr. Amir Oren for being with us, and Mr. Gideon Remez. It's been a pleasure. I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.